Ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to take a seat now, please? We're just going to get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Beattie, and I'm with iPolitics, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here to our first session of 2017. And let me tell you, we have a really action-packed public policy discussions planned for the next 6 months here, both in Ottawa and in Toronto, and we're looking to continue to expand these discussions across the country. For many of you, many new faces, so welcome, and I'd like to just take a couple moments here before I get started into the program. We do things a little differently at iPolitics. Some of you may or may not know how, have never experienced this before, but I just want to walk you through a couple of things that are a little different at our live events. First of all, I encourage everybody to be able to pull their devices out, because we use something called Slido to help manage the interaction portion of this event. Now, for many of you, you'll notice that there aren't a lot of microphones around the room, but we do encourage a lot of participation. So pull out your phones and then pull up I'd like you to go to a website called Slido.com. Now, Slido is not a person, as you know, it's a friend. Because Slido is our best friend for this event, because he's the one who's going to help us speak to and be able to help you ask questions. From there, you can also tweet. We can also have some live polls. So when you go to the event code, just log into hashtag #IPolLockedDown. iPol is in iPolitics, locked down, the name of the event, and it'll bring you right in there. And let's just see how we're doing here, because I wanted to see if everybody can actually actively participate with this. We should have on the screen momentarily. We're actually going to go to the poll itself. There we go. So let's ask this question here, so everybody can play along to make sure that we're all familiar with the technology. So, what ratio of women in federal prisons are Indigenous? Is it 1 in 3, 1 in 4, or 1 in 5? Go ahead and vote now. I can see a number of you are getting on to this now. More and more people. And I want to thank Senator Kim Pate for giving me this interesting statistic here this morning. So I think you guys are getting the handle of it. I can see that we got a lot of people who are very familiar with what's going on right now. The actual answer, as you can see, is 1 in 3. 1 in 3 women in federal prisons are Indigenous. So, fodder for thought for later on. In the system, as you can see, you'll have the ability to be able to ask questions. The questions that you ask have to be limited to 160 characters or fewer. Okay? So it's modern day technology. So think through the questions, but in that process, you'll see that there's a little like sign beside them. And you can actually give it a thumbs up, or like a Facebook like. The ones with the most likes will actually are the ones that Michael will be asking the audience, the panelists later on. So in this case, ask a lot of questions, vote and vote often, vote up your favorite questions, and those are the ones that are going to be when we get to the Q&A portion. That's how we're going to move forward. Okay. So I would like to thank this event. Lockdown today is a byproduct of course, of an investigative series that iPolitics ran through the holiday period that was very well received. It wouldn't be made possible without one of our sponsors this morning, which is USGE. So I'd like to welcome the National President for USGE, Mr. Stan Stapleton, up to the stage to say a few words. Stan?
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of over 16,000 federal public servants represented by the National Union of Solicitor General Employees, I want to thank you for being here today. These 16,000 members work across 17 federal departments, including Correctional Services Canada, the RCMP, Justice, Human Rights, Information and Privacy Commissions, as well as many other smaller agencies. The common thread among these members is their commitment to public safety. What also binds these members together is their commitment to ensuring positive outcomes for those for whom we work. In federal corrections, USG's members are literally on the front lines, working directly with offenders as parole officers, program officers, teachers, case management assistants, librarians, maintenance staff, among other roles. This frontline perspective is crucial to understanding the state of today's federal prisons and, equally as important, the prospects of the vast majority of offenders who do their time and are then released back into the community. This important transition from prison to community is the most significant indicator of our success or our failure. With this in mind, we look forward to a robust conversation today. Thank you.
So one more thing I wanted just to bring forward to everybody's attention. I would ask everybody to actively tweet using the hashtag iPolLockdown today too, okay? So without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague and friend, the executive editor of iPolitics, Mr. Stephen Maher. Come up and say a few words and set the stage for the show. Thanks.
Good morning. In journalism, we like to think that we comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That's something we take pride in the business and at iPolitics, although often on a day-to-day basis, you find yourself wondering whether you're really doing that when you're doing a story on the latest Kelly Leach tweet. But Michael Harris has been comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable for a long time. And having his editing and hosting and putting up these stories in the lockdown series is a matter of considerable pride for us when we're caught up in the day-to-day world of politics, which I'm happy to do, to write the silly little story about Kelly Leach's tweets, because we're creating a record and covering the news. But to be able to do something more substantive like this, I should point out that some of our journalists also worked on the series, Jim Munson, who's here, and Ainsley Cruikshank. I think that we're proud of the work, and it's a pleasure to get to work with Michael on this. I've known Michael since the early 80s when we worked together in Newfoundland for the Robinson Blackmore newspaper chain. I learned an awful lot about journalism from observing Michael in those days when he was the editor of the Sunday Express. I had a front row seat watching him and the journalists at the Express establish a new level of journalistic excellence in Newfoundland, in particular as they uncovered the Mount Cashel scandal, similar to the work celebrated in the Hollywood film Spotlight this year. And I think that the work that Michael did at that time is really unusual and important, and it's not every journalist can do this kind of thing. He was awarded a Doctor of Laws from Memorial University for his unceasing pursuit of justice for the less fortunate among us. And I think that this is a thread that you see throughout his career, including in this work, that he is interested in people who others are not interested in, and paying attention to that. This comes, I think, from a compassion for people who are suffering. That's unusual. It's also unusual that it's matched with the skill to get people to open up to him, to gather information, and to process it at the highest kind of level. And it's all, this is an unusual skill set, or mix of skills. There's also, none of that he wouldn't be able to do the work, though, if he wasn't also kind of brave and cussed. He really, anybody who reads his columns would know that he's going to tell you what he thinks. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce him to you, and I'll get out of the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Some of that was even true. I have to apologize off the top. I've been told that I have a voice like 7 miles of gravel road at the best of times. I have a bit of a cold, so put up with me. We have an exciting group of people today. But before we get into the experts, I'm the amateur, but I've seen a lot of things on a case-by-case basis, whereas the professionals we're going to talk to today have seen systemic things and have a deep understanding, which I think is the beauty of this kind of an event. But Joseph Conrad once wrote that when you look into the abyss looks into you. And all the people that work in corrections look into the abyss on a daily basis. We read about stories in the newspaper when things go terribly wrong, but the people who work in the system look into the abyss and the abyss looks back into them. And I'd like to start out by thanking all the people. And there are many stakeholders. It's not just correctional officers or parole officers. There are all kinds of stakeholders. There are advocates, like the good senator sitting beside me who has worked for 25 years for the interests of women in prison and has a lot to say about especially Indigenous women. We've had Dave Neufeld, who has worked in the Solicitor General's employees area for a long time. He's been a parole officer, and one of the things that I know about parole officers is they have the same stresses that all frontline responders have, and that we don't think about on a daily basis. Even having access to some of the stories in the caseloads that they carry is a daunting thing and has an effect on people. And I think we can later discuss a little bit about the PTSD levels, which are high for correctional officers and high for people in your area who do a great public service. And last but not least, Howard Sapers is a person who has advocated as ombudsman inside the correctional system, cared about people that most people wouldn't have the time of day for, and has shared insights that have made the system better. And today, one of the things we're going to discuss from Howard's point of view is what has been happening over the last 10 years, say from 2015 years to the system. Have we gotten better? Is it getting better for people? And I mean the public, I mean the people who are going to get out of jail one day, I mean the first responders, and other groups that you don't normally think of, like the families of people who are inmates. That's a stakeholders group that hardly gets any attention. But they have a big burden to bear. And we're going to get into a little bit of that today. The format is going to be each of our panelists, our expert panelists, are going to talk for 5 to 7 minutes on their take, their expertise. And we're going to start with Senator Kim Pate. But long before she was a senator, she was an advocate for women's rights. She's worked terribly hard in that area and made a lot of progress for women who end up in prison, and particularly the one group of women that most people don't pay enough attention to, and that is Aboriginal women. I'll just leave you with this statistic. The number of people in the system who are Indigenous women, 37% of the prison population, 4.3% of the general population. There's got to be a serious problem. Get longer sentences, generally get higher security risk assessments, and in the end of the day, there are a few people that will look into the reasons for this. Are these criminals in the normal sense, or are these women who have been criminalized by social factors that don't often make the newspaper? So we're going to start out with Senator Pate. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and I'm sure the people will have questions for you later.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. And I want to start by acknowledging the traditional territory on which we have the privilege of meeting, even though we're several floors up, Algonquin territory, and I want to thank elders past and present for being the guardians of this great territory. And I was really heartened just about the same time as I was moving up to the hill. I understand there was a land claim made, so we look forward to hearing how that goes. But I want to talk a bit about the context that we're in, the context which is where we're seeing increasingly the acceptance of the norming of crime and punishment versus the norming of what people like Louise Arbour would talk about as the fundamental human right that we should be looking at, which is the right, the right to freedom from want. In a country as rich in all kinds of ways, human ways, financial ways, resources, that we should be looking at that. And in a context where you've already heard, for the past 35 years, I've worked in and around prison systems, first with youth, then with men, and for the last 25 years focused on women and girls. And in that context, it is women who are the fastest growing prison population, and yet, when we look at who's in prison, you're hard pressed to determine whether in fact these are individuals who are posing a risk, and certainly, if any risk, a significant risk to public safety. And so everything that happens the minute they come into the system encourages them to be treated in a more secure way, classified at a higher security, kept in more austere conditions, more limited access to programs, less likely to be released into the community. And also, even when they are finally released into the community, if they don't die in prison, they're less likely to return to prison, which actually reinforces the notion that in fact we're not dealing with a significant risk to public safety. So what are we dealing with? You've already heard, and thank you, Michael, for introducing the stat around, and the first question around the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women in this, and men, but particularly women. Poor people. The last time we were able to do the stats, and now hopefully we'll have long-form census again, and we'll be able to look at some of these areas, but the last time we were able to look at the stats for women, more than 80% of the women who were incarcerated were related, their charges, their convictions, and their sentences really were fundamentally linked to their experiences of poverty and their experience of not having access to sufficient resources to live, and it was their attempts to negotiate that poverty, as well as some of the other issues they were dealing with, that really was what gave the impetus for the behavior that led to them being criminalized and imprisoned. As well, the overwhelming majority, it's now more than 1 in 2 women in the federal prison system are racialized. You've already heard the stat on Indigenous women, but also the vast increase in the number of African Canadian, African Nova Scotian, African Caribbean, Black as self-identified, as well as the overrepresentation of South Asian women in certain parts of the population of the country. We're also seeing the increase where you do see women using violence. Increasingly, we're able to disaggregate that information and look at how many of those instances of violence are actually reactions to violence. Very, very few. I can only think of 2 women in all of my years of doing this work who I've encountered who have engaged in what would be determined or characterized as predatory, solitary acts of violence. Most of it reactive, some of it defensive. Also a greater likelihood of pleading guilty in those circumstances, because if they are dealing with violence, they're more likely also to be reacting to violence that the only witnesses to that violence may be their children. They're loath to have their children involved in their cases, or other people near and dear to them. They're also less likely then to involve those children in the process of appeals or reviews or any of that sort of thing. We also see that increasing number, and the one that was very much featured in the series and is very much known, I think, right now, is on the experiences of people, is the issues of mental health and the increasing number of people who are being criminalized essentially because they have mental health issues that are not being dealt with elsewhere, and their behavior, once in a system that does not have sufficient resources to support them, becomes criminalized and characterized as bad behavior as opposed to symptomatic of mental health issues. Many of those, when we talk particularly about women, but I'd say also men, start with histories of their own experiences of abuse. So 91% of Indigenous women, 86 to 87% of women overall have histories of physical and or sexual abuse, and many of them, their responses are, to that is, if not to anesthetize themselves with drugs or alcohol, you actually watch mental health issues literally being born around you. If not before you go to prison, certainly once they're in prison, we see the conditions of confinement that have become more and more secure. resulting in more and more individuals exhibiting behavior that gets characterized as probably more likely to be negative or criminal in the prison context if they were in a mental health context as symptomatic of mental health issues. So what should we be doing? Well, the cost of jailing people is continuing to rise. We don't want to see such an austere system that people are literally just being held in warehoused boxes. But particularly when we talk about women, we know from the only time it was ever costed out in real terms was by the Parliamentary Budget Office, and when Kevin Page was there. And when they looked at just one piece of legislation and the manner in which women were being housed at that time, they came up with a figure of $348,000 per year to keep a woman in federal custody. We know from what happened with Ashley Smith that if you have someone who's also in isolation, who's being kept in more secure settings, that the numbers go up and can be as high as $2 million in a year. So think of what we could be investing those resources in if we were not using them to imprison people. And we could be ensuring every person in this country could be fed, housed, clothed, and educated for the amount of money we're spending on incarcerating increasing numbers of people. So I just want to say, some people have asked me what some of my agendas are in my new job, and in my new job, there's you just heard is my long-term plan. In the short term, I'm hoping that we can do things like eliminate the use of solitary confinement and segregation. I don't care what you call it, we need to get rid of it, and we can get rid of it. And as I just was in Neufeld last week, or on Saturday, I can tell you all kinds of ways we can get rid of it. So that's one. We need to reinsert discretion for judges to not have so many mandatory minimum sentences. In just my tenure, those numbers have doubled, tripled, quadrupled, quintupled. We also need to look at a pardon process that means something. And I would suggest we have an automatic pardon process in this country that's more cost-effective and more effective for for the government as well as for individuals. And so I look forward to the discussion, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Just playing off something you just said, the pardon system under Stephen Harper was changed. If you were looking for a pardon in the old system, you had to wait 5 years, and you had to have a clear record for 5 years before you could apply. Stephen Harper made that 10 years. And that meant that people who were trying to recover and come back, make a comeback, had to wait 10 years with the restrictions of a conviction on their records. And I ran across people in doing this series for whom that was a massive disincentive to reinvent themselves in a constructive way. Now we're going to have Dave Neufeld of the Union of Solicitor General's Employees talk to us about some of the people. I hope that you will describe some of the people that are under your umbrella, what they do, and your assessment of what's happened in the correction system in the 10 years since, or 15 years since 2000, because there have been quite a few changes.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. My name is David Neufeld. I'm the National Vice President for the Union of Solicitor General Employees, and I'm very pleased and excited and honored to be sitting on such a distinguished panel. Not in my 17 years with the Correctional Service of Canada did I ever think I'd be sitting on a panel with a former correctional investigator of Canada and a Canadian senator. Today, we are here to participate in a discussion and a dialogue on crime and punishment here in Canada. And I hope that the perspective that I bring to this discussion will provide a helpful understanding of the system, and a system that's not really well understood by the average Canadian, the federal correctional system, which is my area of representation. Many Canadians have questions about our correctional system and how it works. They have questions about solitary confinement, the over-representation of Indigenous peoples, and also the purpose of conditional and statutory release, and how those forms of release also impact their personal and public safety. The public is very fascinated, and rightfully so, of what it would be like to live behind bars and what it's like to serve time. But the untold story really is the correctional staff who work behind the lines, that people don't really understand the work that they do, and how they contribute to the timely and safe and effective release of offenders back into the community. This is achieved through ongoing assessment, interventions, correctional programming, and also community supervision. The story behind corrections is far more than the clay and mortar of our prisons, or the issues of punishment and lengthy federal sentences. Ultimately, the cultural mandate is about the successful rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders back into our community. Ultimately, well over 90% of all offenders are eventually going to return to our communities. This is why the focus on rehabilitation and reintegration is so very crucial. Myself, I started my career with the Correctional Service of Canada back in 2001 as a community parole officer in Winnipeg. This was during a time in which there was an extreme focus on reintegration and rehabilitation of offenders. There used to be a very strong focus on achieving positive correctional results through the use of day parole, and at the time, accelerated day parole, full parole, and statutory releases. However, with the election of a new government back in 2006, we witnessed a significant shift in how federal corrections was run, and one that was emphasized on a tough on crime agenda. A move was made away from a focus on safe and successful integration of offenders back into the community to one that was more punitive in nature. The tough on crime approach placed a greater emphasis on offender accountability, punishment, longer sentences, and victim engagement. The shift in federal corrections resulted in an organization that gradually became more what we call risk averse. Now, what do I mean by risk averse? It means fewer offenders were being given the opportunity to benefit from a supervised release in the community. This was particularly true for day parole. Consequently, over the last decade, many more offenders were being released at their legislated statutory release date. Now, the responsibility and accountability that comes with working in such a correctional environment is very difficult when you can't think outside of the box and look for solutions and trying to find ways to support a conditional release back into the community. One thing I learned during my time as a community parole officer is anybody can do time. Now, some of you might be wondering, what does that mean? How could anybody do time? The fact is, once you're part of the system, most of our offenders, they're not even a question whether they can finish doing their time. The real question is, can they make it in the real world? Can they become a pro-social citizen who's contributing to Canadian society? Since the change in government in 2015, we have witnessed a renewed focus on reintegration in the Correctional Service of Canada. In fact, CSC is encouraging its staff to renew its energies and focus on the timely and safe release of offenders back into Canadian society. This means more cases are being heard by the Parole Board of Canada, and there's also a strong desire to reconnect with communities where these offenders are eventually returning, and in particular for the Aboriginal communities as it relates to Section 81 and 84 releases. While USGE fully supports this renewed focus on reintegration, we are not confident that the resources are sufficient or adequately put out there to fulfill this mandate. Currently, USGE is very concerned with the fact that CSC is going to be stretched beyond its capacity to ensure that most offenders, including Indigenous offenders, fully benefit from the opportunity to successfully reintegrate back into the community. So I look forward to the ongoing discussion.
One quick question on what you've just said. How much of the problem that we're facing from the point of view of first responders, which your group definitely is, results in people ending up with post-traumatic stress disorder? A lot of people think that firemen and policemen are the only people. I know that correction officers are, again, for frontline people who are the highest number in the country. Do you have a number on how many of your people suffer from PTSD?
You know, that's a very good question, Michael, because that is something that even with us as a union have really struggled to get a number for. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we have actually gone out on our own to solicit information from our own membership to get a really true understanding of how our members, the parole officers, program officers, and so on, who are working with these offenders are really impacted by what we call operational stress injuries. And so operational stress injuries is more than just PTSD. And we don't have that number. I know the correctional officers, I think they are quoting about 36%.
36%.
Which is very high. And to think that, yes, they certainly deal with the static and the dynamic security of the institution, our members are the ones who have those very intimate conversations about what is going on in their life, what they are facing, their criminal offenses, their everything that they've gone through, and that has a true impact on our members. So I would anticipate that potentially our numbers would be just as high, if not higher.
Thank you, Dave. Last but not least, as I was saying, Howard Sapers doesn't need an introduction from me or anybody else. Everybody knows he has been the correctional investigator, the ombudsman inside the federal prison system for a long time, was reappointed by the Harper government, and is on his way to a new job in Ontario, where he will be trying to fix a big mess. And I wish you the best there. Look forward to your sense of what has happened in corrections. Do we have to invest, or is it really more reinvesting in what we once had?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks very much, and thanks iPolitics for arranging this crowdsourcing session to help me with my new gig. Because I'll steal from your questions and the comments from my colleagues on the panel. And congratulations to USGE for the campaign you're engaged in terms of better informing Canadians. Very important discussion, and so every opportunity we have to talk about these issues, I think, is an opportunity just to be taken full advantage of. First, an apology. I'm feeling a little awkward. I'm going to be speaking to people to the right of me and ignoring sort of people to the left of me, which is an interesting metaphor for the last 10 years of my working life. So I mean you no disrespect. I know you're there. Share some numbers. I think my job here is to more fully present the context, and then we get right into the discussion. So I'm going to spend my remaining 4.5 minutes with some numbers, and these are numbers that I think should cause you to think about what it is that our lawmakers and our law enforcers and our law adjudicators are doing on our behalf, because this is the result of that work. There was a question up on the screen about what the growth in the federal incarceration rate has been. Now, it hasn't been as dramatic as some people projected. Over the last decade, it's been about 5%. Today's count, the numbers that I'm basing this discussion on, by the way, are a few months old. They're pretty current, but they're a few months old. So the count the day that I did this snapshot was 14,604 men and women in federal penitentiaries. So it was about 95% men, slightly less than 5% women. So that'll give you some context. When it comes to Aboriginal versus non-Aboriginal, Canada reached a very sad and disturbing milestone back in the summer of 2016, where it was over 25% of the federally sentenced population was of Indigenous heritage. That's, I think, shocking and shameful. It's interesting what has caused that growth. So the population went up about 5%. We're seeing some growth in Indigenous population. That's not because of a crime wave. It's not because crime has gone up. So this incarceration growth and the stacking effect of people spending longer inside prison is not because of longer criminal sentences or more criminal charges resulting in new admissions. It's all pretty much policy driven. So the growth is the result of changes in how we do justice in this country. The abolition of accelerated parole review, the increased number of mandatory minimum penalties, the reduced discretion of sentencing judges, and policy changes around conditional release, which doesn't get talked about quite as much, which has really resulted in more people spending more time in prison and often staying in prison long beyond their eligibility dates, and the risk-adverse nature that Dave was talking about. And I'll drill down on that just a bit. The growth in some of the subpopulations is also something to keep in mind. In that 10-year period, to get us to that post-25% marker for Indigenous Canadians, the growth overall, as I said, was less than 5%. For Indigenous Canadians, the growth in federal penitentiary serving federal time has been nearly 40%. So over 10 years, that population has grown by 40%. For federally sentenced women, as we've heard, it's grown by about a third. For Indigenous women, about 60%. That can't be yet. For Black inmates, it's over 40% growth. dramatically, the biggest growth is in the prairie region of the country. So if you think about who it is that's populating our prairie penitentiaries, again, it's Indigenous men and women, and that's also the largest growing area. I'm only on page 1 of my notes, so I think your watch is wrong. So I won't.
Time flies, Howard.
I won't tell you about that, and I won't tell you about that, but I will tell you about this. When we're talking about mental health, we're now looking at a reality that in federal penitentiary, nearly 1 in 2 federally sentenced inmates will receive a mental health intervention during the coming fiscal year. So with people with a diagnosed or an identified significant mental health need, it's about 26% of men and over half of women, and about 25%, 27% for Indigenous. One of the other hallmarks of women in federal penitentiary is that they overwhelmingly have a history of psychiatric hospitalization and intervention before their federal sentence. Self-inflicted injuries has more than doubled in 10 years. And 28% of all the self-inflicted injuries recorded by the Correctional Service of Canada last year were the result of self-injury amongst 5% of the population. So 28%, 5%, that 5% are the women. So they're much more prone to self-injury once they're incarcerated. Okay, I won't tell you about that, but I will tell you about use of force. So use of force, planned use of force incidents by correctional frontline staff inside our federal penitentiaries has increased by 50% in 10 years. And most disturbingly, 2/3 of those incidents, even the incidents involving use of force inside the psychiatric prisons, the regional treatment centers, 2/3 involve the use of pepper spray as a tool to de-escalate whatever the incident is. I'll finish with talking about discretionary release. So there were 2,202 day and full releases, day parole and full parole releases last year. That number may sound impressive, but fully 2/3 of all the releases from federal penitentiary last year were by statutory release. So we've seen an inversion. The impact that discretionary conditional release is having on the prison population continues to be eroded, and most people are getting release from prison by statute or at warrant expiry. And the proportion of time served before first release has gone up. I have a chart that I could tell you about. The proportion of people who are past their eligibility date but haven't had their case presented to the parole board has gone up. The Auditor General, I see it, the Auditor General did a special report last year, year and a half ago now, and I'll just leave you with 3 concluding statements from that report. CSC officials made fewer recommendations for earlier release of the parole board last year than in the years before. Offenders had increasingly waived or postponed their full parole hearings before the parole board. 65% did so in last fiscal year. And in 2013-14, only a small proportion of offenders, 20%, 1 in 5, had their cases prepared at their first eligibility. So 1 in 5 had their cases prepared at the earliest opportunity to seek conditional release. So big burden on the members that you represent, and big challenges for them inside the system. Again, thank you very much, and thank you for your flexibility.
Thank you, Howard. We have a system in Canada right now that is in transition. One of the things I want to start out by asking all of you is Minister Goodale is currently involved in a review of the correctional system, and in particular, he's taking a look at changes that were brought in under the previous Harper administration. You all know some of the things that changed. We've talked about doubling the amount of time waiting for pardons. The prison farm system was closed down. A lot of programs were cut, and all basically in the name of a view that the restorative justice model had tilted too far in favor of inmates, and Stephen Harper was going to bring it back the other way. I'd be interested in hearing from all of you whether the changes that were made, including the doing away with accelerated parole and other things, have harmed the system or made Canadians any safer, because that is usually the argument that's used, is that if you step away from restorative justice and start either punishing or treating public safety, which is just code for punishment, you somehow have done a turn for people. Start with you, Kim.
Well, I would say that it's much broader than that. It happened even before the last government, that we were seeing a move towards a hardening up of attitudes towards people. And I, for one, don't necessarily think just putting restorative justice in the current system is an answer, because unless we stem the tide of who's being criminalized, we won't actually fundamentally change a lot about the system. And I'm a shout out to Marie-Claude Landry, who's here, Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. It's now 13 years ago since the Canadian Human Rights Commission made some recommendations about what they could do for women to get rid of the discriminatory treatment, the discriminatory classification, the discriminatory lack of programs, discriminatory lack of conditional release, and the discriminatory lack of supports once they're in the community. So all of that was already in place in terms of recommendations. And then you have the overlay of more harsh sentencing and more limited options within that system. And so I think we need to fundamentally rethink what we're doing, and not just try and make ourselves feel better by saying, oh, we'll do it in a nice way, or we'll do a little bit more of than what we were doing now. Well, I think we have to fundamentally rethink what we're doing.
Ralph Goodell was talking with correctional officers in CSC last November, and he made the point that they were going to, on a non-ideological basis, but a fact-driven basis, look at some of the changes that were brought in to see if, first, Canadians were getting the best benefit for the huge investment of money. Just to give you some idea of the amount of money that's being spent, when I wrote my book about the prison system in the early 2000s, the budget for CSC was approximately $800 million. Now that's the budget for the Ontario correctional system. And the budget for the federal system is pushing $3 billion. So a lot has happened. And one of the remarkable things is, with a 38% drop in the crime rate since '98, you would think that it would be reflected in less people in, a better economic picture than the one we're getting, which is escalating costs and fewer people actually breaking the law. Dave, what do you make of Goodell's basic approach that he wants to take a look to see if this system works? Because we know in the United States, the get tough on crime has not worked. In fact, it gave them 1/4 of the inmates on planet Earth as recently as 2013.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that question, because I know that when I talk to our membership, the last decade in particular has had a significant change in the world that we work in and how we work with offenders. And we know that, as you mentioned, I think the budget for, when we were discussing this morning, was about $2.3 billion for federal corrections. It seems like an extremely large amount of money, and we're questioning, why are so many people being, incarcerated and for lengthier periods of time. So the question of lengthier sentences is something that I think definitely needs to be explored. We need to look at, is this the right way to try to keep the public safe? As I had mentioned earlier in my comments, at least 90% or higher of offenders eventually get released back into the community. So knowing that those offenders are coming back, we want to know that they're coming back better than they came in. And that really means that we have those supports, the programming, the interaction with those offenders to gain a really strong understanding of where they're at, what their supports are in the community, and how we can tap into those supports to make sure that they come back. And that includes Indigenous offenders, which are, again, the highest, really overrepresented, particularly in the Prairie region where I come from. It's amazing to think that, in 2017, that these numbers are the way that they are. And I think it really warrants a really strong examination as to why that continues. And from our perspective, we honestly believe that part of this is due to the cuts that came as a part of the Deficit Reduction Action Plan back in 2014.
Thank you, Dave. Howard, you have talked about reinvestment rather than an investment in new ideas. In your experience, when you were looking at what was actually happening inside the prison on a case-by-case basis, was it your sense that the move to getting tough on crime failed? Was it? Do you think that the restorative justice model holds out a better outcome for Canadians because all of these people, most of them, are going to come out again? They're not going to stay there forever or die inside. They're going to come out, and the restorative justice system puts a little more emphasis on the program side of things to equip them, as you were saying earlier, when they get out in the real world. How are they going to make out?
Yeah, restorative approaches, rehabilitative approaches, a focus on reintegration it really needs to be the context, the operating context for any modern correction system. So there's a number of criminologists in the room, and so they can correct me if I'm wrong. But I've never seen any research or body of literature that suggests that there is a direct relationship between crime rates, incarceration rates, and sentence severity in terms of making communities safer. And in fact, if you look at some of the more punitive jurisdictions around the world, what you see is that sometimes they also have some of the most entrenched levels of crime, and often violent crime as well. So we can probably borrow from that literature, from that academic work, and use that to assess the question that you just asked. So does getting tough on crime, does that slogan, does that approach or that philosophy actually make the public safer? I think the answer is is no, and I think it's pretty clear. And so so what should we be doing? And when I talk about reinvestment, I think about things like using some of the things we already have in law. Corrections and Conditional Release Act is actually not a bad piece of legislation, and there's some off-ramps in that legislation. There's some off-ramps in the criminal code. The criminal code tells us that incarceration should be the last resort, that other alternatives need to be sought. The Corrections and Conditional Release Act tells us that there are opportunities for the government to establish relationships with Indigenous communities, for example, for healing lodges, and for parole, release, and supervision initiatives. We haven't taken full advantage of
And in fact, some of those communities, if they get in touch with the federal government, then these people could be returned to their community under that legislation, but it's hardly ever used.
That's right. In fact, there hasn't been a new agreement signed for a healing lodge in years, and there's still, unbelievably, there's still no healing lodges in places like Canada's North, or operating under the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, or in British Columbia. The most recent addition of beds under that part of the legislation were a handful of beds for women in Edmonton, which wasn't a new contract, it was an amendment of an existing contract. So there hasn't been a lot of growth, there hasn't been a lot of uptake on that, which is a very important feature of our law.
So your colleague here raising her hand.
Yes.
So I thank you for raising that, Howard, because it's not just institutions we could be looking at. The legislation allows for sections, we're talking about sections 81 and 84 of the Conditional Release Act, and I would say also think of section 29 for those with mental health. But section 81 and 84 allows Indigenous communities to take responsibility for individuals and have them back in their community. Corrections has interpreted it and put in policy that says it has to be institutions. That's not true. That is not what the law says. And in fact, individual groups, families could be saying, I would like to offer a place for this person to be back, not just on conditional release, but serving their sentence, and there should be supports in place. Now, when those individuals write to the minister, mostly they don't hear back what's available. They get the policy, which makes it look like you can't do it. And I think we need to be challenging. I was just reminded by a group of law students who were with me in Nova on Saturday. They kept saying, well, the policy is supposed to be this, and the law is supposed to be this. How come they're doing that? And the reality is, I think we need to open up and be more transparent about what is supposed to be happening in our institutions and what isn't happening. And I think the impetus then will be for people to get out and not build more institutions, whether they're in the community and run by corrections, or whether they're in the community run by Indigenous communities. We don't need more institutions. We need more of those individualized options.
You know, we have a lot of expertise sitting on the stage today, and we aren't going to get a chance, and I don't want anyone to go away from here thinking that we've covered all the subjects. We won't get close to it. But one of the burning issues for society right now, and by the way, a little bit of a news tip, I hear that January is the month that the federal government is going to announce some sort of a policy on segregation or changes to segregation. One of the hottest debates in the country is whether there should be any segregation, and let me play devil's advocate for a second on behalf of correctional officers. In my discussions with the union representing the correctional officers, they talked about segregation, administrative segregation, pointed out we don't have solitary confinement in the way that you see it in the movies, and that it was a tool that the correctional officers desperately needed. They've told Justin Trudeau that. They've made the same case with Ralph Goodale. And their issue is this one. I'm going to start with you, Kim, because you actually came up in this discussion with them. With respect to segregation, if the BC Civil Liberties Association wins the case, or there is a settlement, and segregation is abolished or changed, would you be willing, do you think it's a good idea, if the prison guards lose segregation, that there be a special handling unit for women who act out violently in prison?
I'll start with the last question. Absolutely not. That's been on the agenda for 30 years, and almost everybody agrees that shouldn't happen. But I need to correct, the BC case is not about segregation. It's only about solitary confinement. It has some recommendations about segregation, but part of the reason we're not involved in those cases is we would say you can end completely the use of segregation. And the last 5 visits to prisons I've been in, there have been no women in segregation or in segregated conditions aside from maximum security, which we consider segregation because it's separation from general population. And when I asked staff and prisoners alike as to when the last women were in segregation in those institutions, almost always it was because someone had hurt themselves. And so it was a self-injury, it's a way of managing women who are self-harming, predominantly women with mental health issues. And when we talk about some of the approaches we used to use, including calling in other women, calling in people like me, calling in people from outside who might assist, everybody said, oh, we can't do that anymore. They have a cookie-cutter approach to policy about how they intervene, and I think that hardens up the system to take, I would have said in my life, I never thought I would see someone pepper sprayed in front of me. Not because it doesn't happen, but because the chances of it happening in front of someone like me are pretty rare. So hardened up has the system become, and so much has that become a standard operating procedure of the most use of force, not the least use of force, that it's now happened in front of me. People in gas masks, pepper spraying someone through the door while I'm standing in the unit, and then urging me to get out before I'm overcome by the effects of the pepper spray. I would have told you you're crazy, Michael, when you used to interview me when we were both younger in this work. If you said that, what if you were dealing with an incident in the midst of happening? I've also had correctional officers say, when my daughter, who's here now as an almost 18-year-old, was a baby with me, say, why don't you take her in? That'll calm down the situation. At the same time as they're considering bringing in the emergency response team, not because they were unkind, uncaring people, quite the opposite. The tools they had been given and the tools they're increasingly given are tools of use of force, not tools of dynamic intervention and de-escalating.
Dave, do you think that segregation should be done away with?
Well, the issue of administrative segregation is one that has been widely discussed more recently, and I think it's something that the Correctional Service of Canada has tried to address because of the discussions that are happening nationally. People are concerned about what's happening with inmates who are being put into solitary confinement for lengthy periods of time, or as we call it, administrative segregation. The safety and security of the institution obviously is paramount, and so is public safety. And I think a real strong approach needs to be taken in terms of how do we deal with those individuals that have to go into administrative segregation for hopefully shorter periods of time, if that's what's required, to help make sure that the safety, not only of the inmate, but of the staff is being taken care of. I often think of the issue of solitary confinement or administrative segregation in the form in my family when my 4-year-old is not behaving well, what do I do with them? How long do I have them sit out on a timeout? Is it a minute? because she's 4 years older? Is it 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours? The length of time matters. And I think that the amount of interaction you have with that particular person in solitary or administrative segregation is important.
How does one compute the amount of time needed?
Exactly. And the thing is that, with the deficit reduction action plan that occurred back in 2014, we saw a major reduction or a major increase in the workload of staff who are required to work with inmates within our institutions. For example, prior to the 2014 year, parole officers in particular would have caseloads of 1 to every 25 inmates. After 2014, that was increased to 1 to 28 in medium security and 1 to 30 in maximum security. And when you look at maximum security and the type of offenders you have in maximum security, you'll hear from frontline staff is we need tools to work with those individuals who can potentially be extremely violent and are not following their correctional plan. And there's many other, not following the correctional plan is not a reason to be in administrative segregation, but there's behavioral issues. So there's things that we need to look at further on how to limit the amount of time that people are being put into administrative segregation.
Thank you. Howard, what is your take, having looked closely at it from the inside, on the whole issue of whether or not correctional officers need that toolkit that they always refer to? We need the tools to do this, and segregation is one of those tools when everything else fails.
I think in an institutional climate, you need an opportunity to de-escalate, and sometimes that means keeping people away from others. So now, how do we structure that, and for how long? So there's essential questions: who goes in, why, for how long, and how do they get out, and who's looking over the shoulder, making sure that's all being done legally and appropriately. Those are the questions of how you manage segregation. Now, the Correctional Service of Canada's segregation use I described as being out of control. And at that point, it was about 8% of the population on any given day could be expected to be in a segregation cell for one of 4 reasons: safety of the institution, personal safety of the individual, to preserve the integrity of an investigation, or for disciplinary reasons. The vast majority of the placements, 2/3 of them, were for the safety and the security of the institution. And all too often, when we looked at the actual person who was in a seg cell for that reason, it's because they were difficult to manage, they were unpleasant, they may have smelt bad, they had bad behavior, bad hygiene, they were mentally ill. And so often we see segregation becoming a housing option for people that are high risk and high need. And the correctional officers in the system is very frustrated that they don't have other housing options. So that's a way to deal with segregation. Segregation should not be a mental health treatment strategy. And when you look at some of the other drivers into segregation and some of the other statistics, what you see, for example, at the point that the proportion of the population federally was Aboriginal was only 24%, only 24, so this is just before we hit that other milestone. The proportion of Indigenous men and women in segregation cells was 30%. So you have an overrepresentation of the, so why is it that we're seeing such a preponderance of Indigenous sentenced men and women in segregation cells? So there's some other issues in terms of meeting the needs of a high risk and high needs population. Finally, when we started paying more attention to segregation, when we sort of rang the bell that it's out of control, without any legislative change and without any policy change, just by paying attention to the existing governance structure around segregation, placements have gone down dramatically. So from about 8% down to about 5%. And so now we have to sustain that change and even accelerate that change. That's without legislative or policy guidance. That's just doing the job the way the job was supposed to be done.
Would you like to see segregation abolished?
I don't think we can abolish, as I say, the need for a place to safely put somebody at a point in time when they need to be separated from others. And
He's saying yes.
I'm really mincing my words because I don't want to. I don't want to have this explode into the same conversation the Senator and I often have. I think we can move the mark down to the sort of the gold standard in corrections, which is under 2% in that kind of
But
housing.
it doesn't need to happen for women. You'd agree with that?
Doesn't need to happen for women. I agree with that.
No, we haven't got much time for our panel left. I want to get to the questions from people who've been listening attentively to this discussion, but I do want to touch on one thing before we leave the panel, and that is death while in incarceration. Christopher Roy at Matsqui, Terry Baker, and of course, Ashley Smith. That's an issue that's captured the public's attention. It made them focus on the correctional system. I'd like to start with you, Kim. How do we deal with the issue of deaths and incarceration where it looks like, as in the case of Ashley Smith, in terms of the coroner's inquest, the finger pointed directly at systemic failures that led to her death? In fact, they classified it as a homicide.
That's right. Well, I think Ashley's death revealed a whole bunch of things that is part of the themes we've been talking about. One, that most people relied on the file information that preceded Ashley to determine who she was. When all was when everything was looked at during the inquest process, and I give credit to Coralie, her mom, who insisted that be a public process. She actually was came and met with my law students this past week, and we talked about the importance of being able to look at individuals as individuals and identify that in Ashley's case, in the end, there were no examples of the types of risk to public safety that were documented against her. And this is the way the system runs when you dehumanize people. She was moved around, her file preceded her, and almost every person to a correctional officer who took the stand, to a psychologist who took the stand at the inquest said, well, I really liked her and I got along well with her, but she had done all these things. And when you question, when did she do all these things? Well, it was somewhere else to someone else based on file documentation. And when we could look at the evidence, as Howard has said, when you look at the videotapes of what was actually happening, it did not resemble at all what was being documented. The behavior did not resemble she's out of control and needs to be forcibly injected. She's lying on a bed complaining that she wants her tampon removed. Not so out of control. And so one of the things we've seen is that after the fact, the system goes into great twists to justify the reactions, the unreasonable reactions to individuals. And Ashley wasn't even identified as having mental health issues till she was dead. But I want to also say what happened in a couple of days ago that hasn't even hit much media aside from the Aboriginal People's Television Network is the wrongful conviction of two women, Wendy Scott and Connie Oakes. The fact that we're not crying from the rooftops that two women were in jail and convicted of second-degree murder without any clear evidence, with certainly disputed evidence and police pursuing that, Crown's pursuing that, defense counsel trying to do what they could, but judge accepting that evidence. And then they end up in custody, and of course corrections again gets the file. Anything the women are saying about what they are or aren't responsible for is deemed to be denial of responsibility. They're ramped up in terms of their classification. So we see in their cases, I think, as well as the deaths in custody, some real evidence that we need to be fundamentally re-examining that lack of accountability throughout in terms of who we're actually going after. Our jails are not full of wealthy people with lots of resources, and that should tell us something.
Just like to...
I'm just going to say self-report studies of people's behavior. We don't do them anymore, but when we used to do them, there is not a person usually who reaches the age of majority has not done something for which they could have been criminalized. The fact that our jails are not more full of people who have relative privilege tells us that something else happens. I think many of us know what that is, but the public isn't encouraged to think about that. And thank you for doing this so that we are encouraging everybody to think about it.
It's interesting that you make that point, because back in 1986, I published a book called Justice Denied, and the subject of that book was a Native Canadian, Donald Marshall, who got in touch with me and basically said, look, I've been in prison for 11 years, and I didn't do this crime. He had, through circumstances that are too Byzantine to go into now, come up with a very good description of the real killer And I found that man in one day in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and he confessed to the murder to me and wrote it down to Donald as an apology. The irony is not only was Donald Marshall Native, Indigenous, he was also not given any programming because he never accepted his guilt. So the issue of an injustice like that was sort of cried from the rooftops back in the day. But as you put it, I have not read many stories about what you've just mentioned, and that's an indictment of all of us. Just want to go to Dave on the issue of deaths in custody. From your perspective, what do we need to do to not have more Ashley Smiths?
I think one of the things that we really need to focus on is the time that we're spending with inmates within the institutions. I know Kim touched on this, that inmates should not be looked at as file information or just another file to rip through and try to understand. I think that we need to be spending more time with those particular offenders that we're working with and ensuring that we truly try to get a good understanding. As Kim mentioned, even understanding whether there's mental health issues or not, for it to come out that late is very concerning, you know. And I think that with a system that is trying to deal with some of the most difficult situations in our society and trying to put together how are we going to help these people, because like again, they're eventually going to return to our communities. How are we going to do that? So my answer to you on that is we need to make sure that the resources are there in order to properly support the work that's being done. And as Howard has also mentioned, that there also needs to be put in the right areas. In terms of mental health, I think that there needs to be more money put into mental health, a more focus on more interaction with those offenders and really understanding what mental health challenges they're facing.
You know, it's interesting. There was no money in the last federal budget for CSC, and yet there is a cry for greater health care within the system, and it's not going to happen without more resources. A little black hook is coming from the stage right here, so I'm not going to be able to give Howard his opportunity to weigh in on that issue. We're going to take some questions from the audience. You've been very patient. The trouble with having great communicators who know a lot is they suffer from the defect of their best point. They could go on and on. We're going to start with a question from Mark Burry, and this is to everybody. Howard, we'll start with you. Do you see a role for mediation in criminal cases?
Well, that's a hugely broad question. I mean, I think the answer is yes, and I think in some cases it happens, and it also depends where you're talking about in the system. So pre-charge diversion, post-charge, other kinds of intervention strategies. Some people even describe some of the negotiation that goes on in terms of joint submissions from Crown and defense as being a form of mediation. So I think the answer is yes, but talk about being able to go on and on and on. I mean, you'd really have to boil that down and say, well, what were you thinking of, and then how would it play through?
Dave.
So again, being on this panel, my perspective has certainly been more the reintegration and rehabilitation of offenders, but as it relates to mediation, I would agree with Howard that there are situations where mediation can be used to help divert people coming into a system that is difficult to deal with. We used to have the accelerated day parole as a tool to get nonviolent first-time federal offenders out of the institutions as early as 6 months. We don't have that tool anymore, so I think we do need to look at other things such as mediation.
Kim.
Well, as Howard said, it is being used in lots of places, continues to be used. And Mark probably knows, having being both a journalist and former student, that one of the first programs, quote unquote, other than literacy that I did in prisons was a program bringing together those who had been victimized with those who were criminalized for victimizing them, particularly in the youth system. But what it taught me was that really it made a lot of people feel better about what was being done, but it didn't fundamentally change what was happening in the system. And so people like me and others left those processes and instead started working on the bigger picture, because I think we really, you know, when you change who gets to mete out justice, then it may look kinder and gentler and softer, but if it doesn't fundamentally change who's criminalized and what the impact is on their life as writ large, then I think we make ourselves feel better, but we don't fundamentally change what's happening.
This is going to be our last question because we are keeping these people from their busy day rather. But for all of you, when I wrote the book on the federal prison system in the early 2000s, 70% of the inmates, part of their criminogenic profile was substance abuse. I quoted that figure to Don Head of CSC when I did the interview with him for the series, and he said it's 80% now. To what extent do you think that is one of the biggest unsolved problems of the system, that there hasn't been any progress, and in fact, inside, maybe you could start, Dave, the problem's gotten worse?
Yeah, absolutely. We know for a fact that substance abuse is one of the largest criminogenic factors we deal with the offenders that are coming into our system. And so when we're dealing with those people that have those substance abuse issues, we need to have effective programming to help them deal with that. That doesn't mean just in the institutions. That also means when they go back into the community. It's one thing to be in an institution where there's supposed to be no drugs, there's supposed to be no alcohol. We know both can exist in an institution.
Zero tolerance is the policy.
And we're fighting vehemently to make sure that that's not happening. But in my opinion, I think we also need to have more access to treatment outside in the community as well, which is not as easily readily available now as a result of major cuts we've had to make in the community. Again, back in 2016, we had to look at cutting $6.36 million out of our portion of the community budget, which is a very small proportion in relation to the institution. And one of those cuts is not being able to put as many people as we would like into other residential facilities that may be required to help deal with substance abuse issues.
Howard.
Yeah, we criminalize addiction in this country to a large extent. We criminalize mental illness in this country to a large extent. It's very hard to disentangle those things. And we have all kinds of discord in our policy approaches. So you have programs that will deal with people with substance abuse histories, but not if they're psychotic, not if they're under psychiatric care. You have other that will deal with people's mental health issues, but only if they're sober. You have housing, you have provincial and territorial policy that works across purposes with federal policy in terms of release and reintegration, getting into social housing and work and social support programs that make it very difficult for people to negotiate, and so they default back to what they know and what they're comfortable with, and that might be something that contributes to their addiction and also their mental illness. So it's a huge issue. Prisons are not hospitals; they're prisons. Some of the people in prisons, though, are patients, and so you have to you have to try to figure that out. And what is the right intervention strategy? And what should the correctional system do with those people? And as Kim said, there are options in law as well to move those people into other kinds of therapeutic settings.
Kim, the last word to you.
So that's Section 29 is the option in law. I would say there are a couple of things that come up. One is that the emerging research on addiction shows that if you actually provide a better place, not austere circumstances, things for people to do and a community of support, many people will not continue on in the addictions if they have other options. Secondly, the greatest use of substances is legal substances by many individuals in the prison system, particularly women. They're drugged to the max often, and why are they drugged? Because they're anesthetizing, being anesthetized or anesthetizing themselves, whether it's legal or illegal substances, to the realities of the histories of abuse, the poverty, the incredible situations they face and start with. And most of the drug programming never addresses that. It's just to do a surface of stop and then never deal with why you're actually there in the first place. And the biggest injection of resources into the prison system to deal with so-called contraband was after the tobacco ban. And so the biggest contraband in the prisons is not actually drugs and alcohol, it's cigarettes, and we have all kinds of drug introduction techniques now to go after tobacco, when in fact those resources, I would argue, could and should be being put into Section 29 agreements so that people can be going out to really address the issues of why they're even using drugs and alcohol in the first place to anesthetize themselves. And so looking at that emerging research and learning from it and not just ignoring it and pretending it doesn't exist.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming in here today. Howard, best of luck in your new endeavors in Ontario. Dave, keep
Free
up the
the
good
people.
work. And the new senator has a steep learning curve, she tells me, but I think she'll do just fine. I want to thank all of you for coming in, and if I could end on just a personal plea, watch carefully what Ralph Goodall does when he comes to implementing changes to the system. I think you've heard from our expert panel the kinds of things that need to be thought through. It can't be done on political whim, which I think was a great deal, a big part of the problem in the Harper years was a lot of things were done for ideological reasons. And the proof is when you talk to people in this system, they all said the same thing. They were never consulted on many of the big changes. The experts weren't consulted. And in fact, it became a bit of a curse to be an expert. So watch what he does. It's terribly important. We at iPolitics will be continuing to follow it closely and should watch for these names in the news because they always will add to what you know. And again, thank you for spending this morning with us.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize. We went a little over time, and a big part of what we do is like to accept questions and answers from the audience. We do not have the time for them today. We had a whole bunch of them, but I promise you they are not for naught. With a live journalism event, what we do is I'll take those questions. I'm going to circulate them both to the panelists, to Michael, and to our newsroom, because often we know that there are good stories couched in those questions. And we're going to continue to explore them, not only through our editorial coverage, but also through our live event series. So we know, based on the discussions that we had, that we could carry on ad nauseum on this. And I would have liked to have had the time, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Just real quickly, looking forward as we move forward, next week, for those who might be watching live on Facebook right now, we're going to be in Toronto. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce next Tuesday is releasing their annual Crystal Ball Report, which is their economic and political outlook. We will be hosting another iPolitics Live event right from the TMX Broadcast Center in Toronto on Tuesday. Registration is open. You're welcome to join us then. Back here in Ottawa on Wednesday, we're the third part of our Innovation in Action series. We are going to be right here from the Rideau Club talking with, as we examine third sector innovation and what's involved in third sector innovation as that sector has undergone tremendous change and what it means to evolve now into as we move forward. Looking a little further ahead, on January 31st, we continue on with our more public policy discussions as we examine lung wars. And that is the new vaping and tobacco control legislation that's being put forward, Bill S5. Senator Penniclerk, who has introduced that bill, will be here, and she'll be talking with a great panel of experts to go back and forth on the merits of Bill S5. So I hope you can join us. Registration is all available and open right now. You can go to iPoliticsLive right off the iPolitics website to register. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. We look forward to welcoming you again at a future iPolitics Live event. Have a great day.